Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our presentation today. This is ISO 9001:2015, an introduction to the world's most popular standard. My name is Joe Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager here at PJR. A couple of housekeeping notes for everybody. All of our participants today are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions, so please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address questions at the end of the presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is whether or not the presentation is made available after we're finished. We do make all of our webinars available in two ways. If you'd like to get a copy of the slides, those will be available for download from our website shortly after we're finished. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar with the voiceover, we do post all of our webinar recordings to our YouTube page, and that is also accessible on the website. You'll simply need to look for the link entitled Previously Recorded Webinars. Now, our topics for today, we're going to unpack ISO 9001 in a couple of different ways. We're going to start on the scope statement of ISO 9001. That's probably the best way to understand what the standard is all about, what it intends to accomplish. We're going to have a little bit of discussion on one and all other ISO standards come from and go over the process by which they are developed. We're going to include with that discussion some discussion of the Annex SL and how that impacts the writing of ISO 9001. We'll go over the standard kind of cover to cover, give you an understanding of what's where. And then I've got an extensive section that I call key ideas. And there's 5 main pieces that I'm going to unpack in this presentation. I've actually got some new content today. Some of you may have heard about some changes coming to ISO 9001. I've got some updates for you on that. We'll have a couple concluding remarks and then your questions. So let's begin with what is ISO 9001? Well, ISO 9001's official title is Quality Management Systems Requirements. So it is intended for the establishment of a quality management system. Now, its intent is outlined in its first auditable section, its first numbered section, section 1.0, which is called scope. Now, I've actually provided the full statement here. We're going to unpack this statement over the next several slides so that you have a sense of what they were going for when they wrote this section. Now, this verbiage that I've got on the screen here, this is actually unchanged going back over the last 3 editions of ISO 9001. You'd have to go all the way back to the 1994 version for this to be any different. So we've had this now as the scope of record for almost 25 years. So let's begin at the front end of this statement here in section 1.0. It states that this international standard, in other words, ISO 9001, specifies requirements for a quality management system. Now, this first part is important because we have to understand that ISO 9001 is a system standard. It's not a standard that tells you how to manufacture your product or how to render your service. It is a standard for the quality management system. Any organization that seeks to be certified to ISO 9001 still has to define for itself how products are made, how services are controlled, etc. And the organization needs to demonstrate its ability to consistently provide products and services. And this is another kind of key aspect, this inclusion of services. You'll actually read this verbiage throughout ISO 9001. It refers to products and services, and so this was actually part of an evolution that we had. The idea that originally ISO was viewed as only being for companies that manufactured tangible products. That evolved, and now service-based organizations, companies that provide transportation routing or training services, etc. These companies can see benefits from getting ISO 9001 certified also. That meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements with the aim of enhancing customer satisfaction. Now, this is, for as long as there's been an ISO 9001, this focus on the needs and concerns of the customer. This is something that's been there since day one. Organizations are expected to be receptive and responsive to the needs of their customers. That is unchanged, and it's as important now as it ever was. Through the effective application of the system, including processes for improvement of the system and the assurance of conformity to customer and statutory regulatory requirements. So this last bit of that scope statement acknowledges the ongoing nature. It's not something that you implement and forget about. It's an ongoing process for following what you establish in your quality management system, abiding by your controls and etc. And this inclusion of improvement foreshadows the importance of improvement in the overall nature of ISO 9001. This is actually something that we'll be touching on a bit later when we cover key ideas. So let's talk a bit about where ISO 9001 and the other ISO standards come from. The ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, it's a collective. It's made up of numerous international members. Now, each of the standards that they publish is assigned to a committee. In the case of ISO 9001, it is a technical committee, and it happens to be Technical Committee 176. Now, TC 176 includes membership from each of the major industrialized nations. Now, here in the United States, our representatives come from the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI. Now, in terms of how the standard is organized and why it's numbered in the way that it is, we have to take a look at a key document that was developed 3 years before ISO 9001 2015's publication. ISO 9001 2015 was part of a much larger effort on the part of the ISO. And that effort was commonly referred to as Annex SL. Now, Annex SL you may have heard of. It's been referred to as the high-level outline, Annex XL, etc. It's part of a larger ISO publication. As the name would imply, it's an annex. And that publication is ISO IEC Directives Part 1, Consolidated ISO Supplement Procedures Specific to ISO. So this, you can think of this as a set of self-imposed rules for writing ISO standards. That's really what Directives Part 1 is all about. It's a set of rules, it's a set of bylaws for writing ISO standards. And it's actually public domain. So if you were to Google Directives Part 1, Consolidated ISO Supplement, you'd find it for yourself. The ISO publishes it right on their website. So if you're curious what the process is that they follow, it is available for you to review. Now, Annex SL was first written into the Directives Part 1 back in 2012. And it was developed by a special committee called the Joint Technical Coordination Group. And what this group wanted to accomplish, what they were going for by doing this, was a 10-section blueprint for writing the ISO family of standards. And what this was intended to do was, if you have, say, an ISO 9001 system, and you want to add ISO 14001, in the long ago past, those two standards had different clause numbers, different terminology, and this was viewed as an effort to kind of blend these requirements and make multiple standards a little easier to attain for a single company. So again, Annex SL, what it presents is a 10-section blueprint for writing the ISO family of standards. It presents common terms and core definitions. Now, at this point, all of the standards published by ISO have completed their transition to the Annex SL format. As I said, this goes back to 2012. We've had it now for 12 years. And in fact, some of the standards are, including ISO 9001, as we'll learn, are already in the process of being revised for their next editions. So here's an example of how Annex SL works. On the left, I've provided an excerpt from section 9.2.1. This is the section that mandates activities for internal audits. Now you can see here that there are portions that are presented in X's. Good example of this is subclause A1, where it says that the management system needs to conform to the organization's own requirements for its XX management system. In ISO 9001, of course, we're talking about quality management systems. So on the right, where we have ISO 9001, section 921, you can see that both of the X marks have been replaced with the term quality. So that's a kind of a microcosm example of how this works in terms of turning Annex SL into ISO 9001 or any other standard that's being published by the ISO. Now within Annex SL, and therefore by way of extension within ISO 9001, there are 7 auditable sections, and they're numbered 4 through 10. So in section 4, we have some very high-level requirements, things like determining who the interested parties are, what is the scope of the quality management system, what are the processes. We continue into sections 5 and 6, we've got some more high-level stuff. Leadership is mentioned in section 5, development of your quality policy, development of responsibilities and authorities, determining what the roles are. In section 6, we kind of have 2 main pieces. We have the risk-based thinking requirements and quality objectives. In section 7, we have support, which touches on a number of different areas. We talk about human resources, so this is where training requirements are found. We talk about measurement resources, calibration and so forth. We talk about document resources, so your documents, your records, what have you. Now, for most organizations, the primary requirements, the primary activities, I should say, the day-to-day activities are going to be most directly influenced by Section 8. Section 8 is called Operation, and it covers, in a very linear fashion, you can kind of think of it as the life cycle of what an organization does. So it starts with requirements for products and services. You can think of that sort of as the sales section, the customer service section, the order entry section. And it just kind of progresses in a natural way. We have design of products, control of externally provided processes, so what you might call purchasing, production and service provision, followed by release of products, release of services, and then control of non-conforming outputs. The standard, the auditable portion of the standard then wraps up in section 9 and 10, where we cover all of the different ways in which an organization is expected to monitor what it's doing. So we have things in Section 9 like customer satisfaction, internal auditing, management review. And then Section 10 is called improvement, and it also includes the clauses that relate to the corrective action process. Now, taking a step even further back, let's take a look at the numbering of the standard, kind of cover to cover, because there is more obviously to the standard than just the auditable portion. In section 0.1, we have a general introduction section. It provides kind of an overview statement, some thoughts on who ISO 9001 is intended to benefit, and it gives a preliminary discussion on some very high-level ideas, things like risk-based thinking, plan, do, check, act, and it gives official definitions for 4 terms that are universal to all 3 standards. The first of these is shall. Now, you may have heard auditors talk about shall statements, or that's a shall statement. Well, a shall statement is used within ISO 9001 to indicate a mandatory requirement. Obviously, there are multiple shalls in ISO 9001. I don't have a count, but that's what the standard is supposed to do after all, is establish what is required. There is also a term referred to as should. Now, shoulds are more common in other ISO publications. What they represent rather, is a recommendation. This is something that you could do. Now, there are some uses of the word should in the non-auditable portion, but there are none in the auditable portion. You will not find the word should in sections 4 through 10. We also have may, which represents a permission. This is used once in the auditable content, and then can, a possibility or capability. So a list of options, basically. And there are multiple instances where that term is used. In section 0.2, we are presented with the concept of the 7 quality management principles. These are actually more directly unpacked in the ISO 9000 document. ISO 9000 is the fundamentals and vocabulary publication. But these 7 quality management principles are the high-level ideas. And these are, to an extent, the ideas upon which ISO 9001 itself is based. So these cover things like customer focus, the process approach, improvement, some of these ideas that we've already been mentioning a bit. The process approach itself is unpacked a bit further in section 0.3. There is a graphic that provides some clarification on what is intended by a process approach, and this high-level idea of plan, do, check, act, this PDCA cycle, which goes back now to the 2000 version of ISO 9001. In 033, we have some preliminary discussion on what risk-based thinking is all about and the importance of this concept. And in 0.4, we have some discussion on how ISO 9001 relates to other management system standards, such as 9000 and 9004. In section 1, we have the scope, which we unpacked earlier in our presentation. Section 2 is called normative reference, which establishes that the definitions that appear in the ISO 9000 fundamentals and vocabulary document, those definitions are considered binding in the context of an ISO 9001 audit. So in other words, those definitions are applicable in a 9001 audit, even though ISO 9000 itself is not a certifiable document. Now, section 3 is called terms and definitions. Currently, there are no official terms and definitions that are specific to ISO 9001. It does refer to 9000, for the terms and definitions that appear therein. It's possible that someday we will have official definitions within ISO 9001 itself, but currently we do not. We've already gone over sections 4 through 10, so let's move on to the annexes. There are 2 of them. Annex A is a series of 8 special explanations and advice, really. In A1, we are presented with this idea that the organization that gets ISO 9001 certified does not have to have a set of procedures or a quality manual that utilize the section numbers from 9001 or even the terminology from ISO 9001. You are the masters of your system. You are allowed to number your procedures however you wish. You are allowed to refer to items within your system however you wish. You do not have to use the terminology or numbering from ISO 9001. In A2, we have a little bit of a more extensive discussion on the intent in having the terms products and services essentially be equivalent to each other in the context of the standard and what was intended by that. A3 presents some deeper understanding of what we mean by interested parties and what is meant by identifying relevant interested parties. In A4, we have this concept of risk-based thinking. Now, this was an extensive section that was intended to help companies get more comfortable with the idea. This was a new idea at the point that the 2015 revision of ISO was published. It does emphasize in A4 that a formal risk management process is not required, and that is still very true. The approach that you take to the requirement for risk-based thinking is at your discretion, but it does not have to be a full-fledged risk management process. In A5, we have some discussion on the idea of non-applicable clauses. This replaced at the time the concept of exclusions, so they wanted to provide some clarity on that. A6 is semi-critical. It talks about the term documented information. Now, at the time that the ISO 2015 standard was published, it replaced some verbiage that was better understood at that time. Records, documents, procedures, all of that is swept up under the concept of documented information now. So it's meant to be a more inclusive term. In A7, we have some in-depth review of the concept of organizational knowledge and the types of challenges that organizations face in terms of their team, their crew. And in A8, we have control of externally provided products and services. Now, this is a more expansive explanation on this phrase and what it is meant to be an external provider. Annex B is a more extensive discussion on the relationship between ISO 9001 and other ISO publications, and the standard concludes with a bibliography. Excuse me. So over the next several slides, what I'd like to do, I realize some of the folks on the call today, you are not yet ISO experts, and it's been my experience that if we can break this thing down to its essence, it's a little easier to understand ISO 9001 if you have a more firm grasp on what the key concepts are. And for me, ISO 9001 is best understood in terms of these 5 key ideas: scope, processes, accountability, effectiveness, and improvement. So let's start with scope. Early in the standard, it's actually in section 4.3, you are told that you need to develop a scope statement. A scope statement, a scope of your quality management system. Now, the way to understand what a scope is It is a defining of the extent and boundaries of your quality management system. It's a statement of what you do and what you have achieved ISO 9001 certification for. So here's a couple examples. Design, fabrication, and assembly of collapsible tripods, distribution of fasteners, plating, heat treating, and sorting of metal stampings. So you can read this statement and know, okay, I can kind of envision what it is this organization does. That's the intent. And as you can see, there's nothing in here that says world class. There's nothing in here that talks about there's no qualitative verbiage, there's no vague verbiage. It's right to the point, and that's the intent. Now, the scope statement that you develop should be the same as that shown on the ISO 9001 2015 certificate that gets issued by PJR. Now, a key aspect of this, a key thing to consider, do not list an item on your scope that won't be available for audit. So for example, if you want to have field installation in your scope statement, that means we have to go into the field. We have to do an audit of this field installation activity if we're going to list it on the certificate. If you've purchased new equipment that isn't up and running yet, and this represents an expansion of your scope, we can't list that on the certificate either. So bear these things in mind in terms of what we can certify you for. Also, and I always like to be very careful to explain this. Be careful about being too wordy in your scope statement. Let's consider an example. Let's say that the organization is telling us they want their scope to be laser cutting, water jet cutting, progressive die cutting, plating, heat treating, and distribution of flanges, springs, shims, bolts, and barrels. Now, in that situation, we have to audit laser cutting, water jet cutting, and progressive die cutting, and plating, and heat treating and distribution. And we have to ensure that we sample flanges, springs, shims, bolts, and barrels. If there's too much in that scope statement, we may have to add audit time in order to accommodate it, especially if it's a smaller company and they want all of this stuff in the scope statement. Now we're looking at a situation where we may have to do a 3-day audit. Obviously, that's going to be more expense for you. Moving on to another core idea, the core idea of processes. This is another one that comes up early. This time it's in section 4.4. And what it says is that the organizations need to determine what their processes are and how they interface with each other. Excuse me. Section 4.4 states that a quality management system is made up of processes. Now, this is a key concept within ISO standards. We actually have a whole webinar called The Interaction of Processes and Its Importance to a Successful Audit. If you've not seen it before, I do highly recommend it. We've had great feedback on it. So if you need some help in getting your arms around what you need to do with what your processes are, that's a good webinar for you to check out. Now, the concept of processes then kind of cascades throughout ISO 9001. And I've got a sampling of clauses here where it's mentioned. The process approach gets its first mention in section 511, but it continues from there. There's discussion of aligning quality objectives to processes in section 621. Competent staff for all processes. This is mentioned in section 712 and 716. Ensuring effective infrastructure for processes is mentioned in section 713. Control over external processes is discussed in section 8.4. Review of process performance gets mentioned in section 932. So as you can see, and this is just a sampling, mind you, the whole idea of processes, it really is everywhere in ISO 9001. Now, we encourage you to make your processes as personal and unique to your business as possible. You know, remember that this is your system, these are your processes, and one thing I always mention to companies, you probably already know what your processes are. You already know what they are and how they interface with each other. It's just it's a business of capturing this concept and putting it down on paper and making it available for audit. If you do it the right way, it's going to make the ISO 9001 system a more value-added element of your business. And I encourage you, do not use the names of the sections of ISO 9001 as the names of your processes. I assure you, you don't have a process called resource management. If you do, I'll take a look at it. But my experience, no company has a process named resource management. Let's move on to our third key idea, accountability. Now, ISO 9001 stipulates that the people that work within the company all share responsibility for the success or failure of the quality management system. And that includes top management. And that's actually mentioned in section 511. It even says in 511, top management shall be accountable for the effectiveness of the quality management system. This was a kind of a revolutionary idea 9 years ago when the new version of the standard was published. This whole idea that the top management had to step up and take responsibility for what was going on with their system. Now, there's a lot of other places where accountability is demanded. In section 8.6, it says that product release records, what you might call inspection records, have to name names. Who released this? Who said it was okay? In section 10.2, it says that if there are problems, if there are complaints even, they have to be responded to with corrective action. That you have to define roles and responsibilities. That comes from section 5.3. Everyone within the quality management system needs to know about the quality policy. That's section 522. And they need to know about their contributions to the effectiveness of the quality management system. That comes from section 7.3. So this idea of accountability comes up in a lot of different ways. Moving on to key idea number 4, effectiveness. Now, ISO 9001 has numerous requirements that require you to measure the effectiveness of something. And the intent is that you need to know how well or how poorly things are going within your company, within your operation. Now, this basic idea of effectiveness begins in section 441C, and I've actually provided a direct quote here. It says that the organization has to determine and apply the criteria and methods needed to ensure the effective operation and control of processes. You need to figure out what your performance indicators are, and you need to apply those indicators. You need to have your finger on the pulse, as it were, of your quality management system. So again, we have multiple clause numbers we can point to where these effectiveness measures are called out. So quality objective, 621. Evaluation of competency action, 7.2. Product inspection, section 8.6. Customer satisfaction, 912. Internal audit assessments, 9.2, and so forth. Lots and lots of different areas in ISO 9001 where this idea of was this effective is applied. Lots of different areas, lots of different concepts. The last cornerstone concept that we are going to go over today is improvement. Now, I mentioned earlier that improvement is listed as one of the 7 quality management principles, and it's even listed in the scope statement for ISO 9001. Now, this was actually an evolution of an older idea. The older idea was originally called continual improvement, and you may still have some auditors that you will encounter that still refer to it as continual improvement. I think we can forgive them for that. But the idea, the concept is actually titled improvement. And it's this idea that there's a lot of ways we can attain improvement, not just continual improvement, but reactive changes and breakthroughs and innovation and other similar concepts. Now, improvement is discussed primarily in section 10.1 of ISO 9001. And again, I've provided a direct quote that you shall determine and select opportunities for improvement and implement actions to meet customer requirements and enhance customer satisfaction. It's an interesting callback to the concept of the customer, the primary interested party, and their importance in what you do within your quality management system. Again, there are other sections that we can look to where improvement is mentioned, not just 10.1. In 4.4, it says that the organization has to continually improve its quality management system. In 5.1.1, it says that management must promote improvement. In 5.2.1, it says that your quality policy must address improvement. It must be included as a talking point. In 5.3, we have this concept that responsibilities include reporting on opportunities for improvement. In 6.1.1D, that risk action efforts should target improvement. 7.1.1, that resources should enable improvement. 7.3, that people that work for the organization need to be aware that their efforts are going to impact improvement. And then finally, section 932F, that opportunities for improvement should be among the things that you're talking about within management review. So let's move on. And I mentioned this at the front end of the presentation. There is work being done on ISO 9001 itself. They are working on a revision to it. Now, here's what we don't know. We don't know when it's going to be published. We've been told they're targeting 2025, but you have to understand that this is not definite. And we know that, at least preliminarily, there's not going to be a great deal of change coming with it. But nothing firm has been published. So, you know, we have to be very careful about being speculative about what could change or what might change. Now, there is one new requirement that we can talk about, and this is the requirements pertaining to climate change. So let's explore this concept just a bit. Now, back in February of this year, the ISO took a rather unusual step. They published an amendment to ISO 9001 without reissuing the standard in whole. And the reason that they did this is unclear, but it was thought that they were viewing this as an important idea. Now, the amendment that was published, it's actually free to acquire. So if you already have a copy of ISO 9001, or even if you don't, you can visit the ISO website and find this amendment, get a copy of it for yourself for free. Now, the amendment specified 2 clausal updates. So what I'd like to do over the next 2 slides is show you how these clausal updates factor into the actual standard. Let's start with section 4.1. So here in the upper part of the screen here, I've got the existing section 4.1 language, where it says that you need to determine external and internal issues that are relevant to purpose and strategic direction. and that you need to monitor and review information about those external and internal issues. Now, the new language is, you shall determine whether climate change is a relevant issue. So they want you to consider climate change as a potentially relevant issue. Okay, so that's 4.1. Here is the change that was made to section 4.2. This time it's just a note. 4.2 is the interested party clause. This clause talks about that you need to determine interested parties that are relevant to the quality management system and the requirements of those interested parties, and that you need to then monitor and review information about those interested parties. The note says relevant interested parties can have requirements related to climate change. So again, they want you to kind of consider that and bear that in mind as you are determining interested party requirements. Now, what did these two updates mean for your company? Well, for this, we have an official statement from the IAF. This is the International Accreditation Forum. And they issued kind of a wordy bit of guidance on this. I'm not going to read this to you in total because I've actually got a summary of it on the next slide. But if you want to get a copy of this guidance for yourself, it is available for free on the IAF website. If you want to Google IAF guidance on climate change, you will find this memorandum yourself. So let's boil this down to what they really mean. Basically, the expectation is going to be that you consider climate change as a potential relevant issue to your quality management system and that you have acted accordingly. In other words, it's possible for you to conclude that climate change has no bearing. Certainly, we will accept that as an outcome, but you need to be prepared to show evidence of how that decision was reached. You cannot just reach that conclusion out of thin air. We need to be able to see that this was done with a little bit of process, that you applied kind of a systemic approach in reaching that conclusion. ISO 9001 is still the world's most utilized standard. There are over 900,000 registered companies worldwide. Any company that wants to get certified would do well to bear in mind the big picture of what ISO 9001 seeks to promote. Now, if you're ready for a deeper dive, we do offer a clause-by-clause primer course for anyone that's new to ISO 9001 and wants to have a better understanding in preparation for audit or other purposes. Now, the title of our course is ISO 9001, a clause-by-clause analysis. It can be found on the PGR website. It is 100% free to take. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. The sister webinar to this one is called ISO 9001 2015, Anticipating Auditor Expectations in Key Areas. Now, this is a kind of an unpacking of some of the more common issues that we see in ISO 9001 audits and what is expected for those areas. So again, if you're brand new to ISO 9001, I encourage you to join us for that presentation as well. That one is going to be coming up. I believe we've got one scheduled for next month. We also have a somewhat newer presentation called Your Ongoing Relationship with PJR. Now, this presentation goes over some of the different resources that we have for times when things are changing in your organization, and it also goes over the dispute process. And lastly, I'd just like to remind you, we do have that presentation on the interaction of processes and its importance to a successful audit. This is a very popular webinar. It's helped a lot of companies get over development of their process maps and how to put them together in a way that they're ready for audit assessment. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best way for you to do that is to visit our website at www.pgr.com. go to the bottom of the page, enter your email address in the provided space, and click subscribe. You will be opted in for automatic updates on new webinars, changes to the standard, and other helpful points of information. I do thank you for your time. I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard. We'll see if we have any questions today. Okay, so Anil Desai asks, what does 176 stand for in TC 176? It doesn't stand for anything, Anil. It just refers to the fact that Committee 176 was the 176th technical committee that was put together by the ISO. You have to remember that they've been writing standards since 1946. Anil has a second question. Looks like Annex SL is a template for the development of ISO standards for management systems, quality, IT, etc. That is correct. All of the ISO standards are intended to follow the SL format. Do we have any other questions today? Okay, well, thank you all for your time, and have yourself a real good day.